Welcome to another story from Ghost Stories of America, compiled by Dan Asfar and Edric Thay. Go ahead, guys, grab your copy, get nice and snuggled warm by the fire, and hope that your house is not as haunted as this house. This one is in Massachusetts, the Joshua Ward House. Please leave a comment down below if you've been in this house or what your thoughts are on this house and of this story. Let's go ahead here and start right up. Salem, Massachusetts. If the name of any place in America invokes images of the supernatural, this old New England port town would be the one. Barren trees lining colonial avenues, low clouds hanging over a darkening sky, black cats slinking around foreboding old houses, and, of course, the ever-present sense that the specter of a long-dead witch might suddenly appear around the very next corner. In the public eye, every day is Halloween in Salem. If this is a bit of an exaggeration, it is certainly true that the past weighs heavy on this Massachusetts town. The infamous witch trials of 1692 seem to have burned an indelible mark on the place. While there are those among us who might scoff at the idea that events of 300 years ago still have the power to frighten, we would do well to respect the force of history, which time and again has proven capable of coming back to haunt us. There are none more certain of this than those who have had the misfortune of coming face to face with one of the long-dead specters from Salem's troubled past. Many people have had such experiences in the town. Some have seen the ghost of an elderly woman in the house of the Seven Gables, the same house where literary great Nathan Hawthorne received inspiration to write the horror story by the same name. Others have seen the spirit of which is suspected to be Abigail Ropes in the Ropes mansion. The Massachusetts Grand Dame was said to have been standing too close to the fireplace in her bedroom and was quickly engulfed in flames after the fire caught on her nightgown. There are also the stories of the spirit of Giles Corey haunting the old jail. Corey was accused of being a warlock. He refused to go to the trial and died after a brutal 2-day interrogation where he was crushed to death under stone weights. His apparition was appeared at an old jail numerous times, staring blankly before terrified onlookers. It is said that without fail, some local calamity follows shortly after he appears. Giles Corey isn't the only casualty of 1692 that appears before the frightened onlookers. Condemned witches have appeared around Gallows Hills on some evenings. Transparent images of women dressed in colonial attire drifting about aimlessly. These females, wraiths, are also said to be harbingers of calamity to those who have seen them. But of all the ghosts in Salem that have their roots in the infamous witch trials of 1692, the most talked about would be the spirit that drifts around the Joshua Ward House, the mansion. The 3-story brown stone was built in the late 1700s by one of the Salem's premier merchants, Joshua Ward. It was built on Salem Harbor, with a view of the water that brought in Mr. Ward's cargo-laden ships from abroad. By all accounts, nothing too out of the ordinary transpired in the mansion while Joshua Ward lived in it. He was an esteemed member of the Salem gentry, and it is entirely possible that the master of the house made sure his servants kept quiet about home life in the Ward house to avert unwanted whispering. For almost everyone who has lived in the house since the original owner passed on has come away with thoughts of the afterlife foremost in their minds. Those seeking explanations for the bizarre events occurring in the Joshua Ward house have been drawn to the very foundations the house was built upon, to the wooden house that once stood where the brick mansion stands today. George Corwin, sheriff of Essex County, resided in the house during the Salem witch trials. One of the judges of the controversial proceedings that sent 19 people to the scaffold and saw more than 100 New Englanders jailed. Corwin was also in charge of all property confiscated from convicted witches. It was said that he made a small fortune selling the lands of these unfortunates, growing ever wealthier as the grisly witch hunts continued. Corwin's role in the 1692 trials did not make him popular in Salem, and after the witch hysteria died away, innumerably silent accusations whispered over the succeeding years reshaped his identity within the community, changing him from a respected judge into an accomplice in murder. None hated Corwin more than Bob and Mary English, a couple accused of witchcraft who fled to New York before they could be brought to trial, returning to Massachusetts after the hysteria died down. The Englishes discovered that George Corwin, acting on behalf of the state, had sold their estate. They tried suing to get their property back, but the court of law at the time forbid any legal action against the county government. Yet local lore tells us that Bob and Mary were able to win one grisly prize in their legal wrangling with Essex County. Legend has it that the Salem court, in a bizarre twist of colonial legality, awarded the Englishes a lien on George Corwin's corpse. While it was a worthless prize, it was the only compensation the couple were given for their losses, and they clung to it with a kind of fervor reserved for the most profoundly wronged. When Corwin died, it was said Bob and Mary waited outside his house, promising they would seize the sheriff's corpse the moment it was removed from his house. The Corwin family, disgusted by the morbid determination of the Englishes, were determined to keep Corwin's remains in the family and buried George in the cellar floor. The dead person entombed within a house is almost a surefire way to acquire a haunting. But it did not end there. 17 years after Corwin was buried in the basement, his remains were disinterred to receive a proper burial in one of the local cemeteries. Joshua Ward had the Corwin home demolished to build his own mansion on the site. Oddly enough, the Ward house haunting doesn't seem to be perpetrated solely by the spirit of George Corwin. In fact, the most distinguishable ghost in the house isn't the old Essex County sheriff, but an anonymous woman whose apparition has begun to appear with increased frequency over the last decade. Richard Carlson purchased the Ward house in the late 1900s, intending to make the building the headquarters for his realty company, Carlson Realty. He had no way of knowing that the house he had bought was unlike any piece of real estate he had ever bought or sold before. The first indicator that things in the house were not as they seemed came from a house alarm that seemed to operate with a will of its own, sounding in the middle of the night for no reason at all. It became a regular chore of Richard Carlson, or his partner, Julie Tash, to get out of bed and shut the alarm off. It happened so often that the couple began to notice that whoever was operating the alarm seemed to prefer Richard to Julie. for the alarm would shut off the moment Richard opened the front door and stepped inside. When Julie went to turn off the system, she would have to go all the way down to the cellar before the alarm quit. Who was triggering the alarm? And who did it seemingly shut off by itself? Difficult questions which Julie and Richard tried to ignore as best they could. Other individuals have had far more vivid experiences in the Joshua Ward house. One of Carlson's Realty's clients was in her real estate agent's office in the middle of a busy afternoon when their business was interrupted by the agent's telephone. The woman was waiting for the realtor to get off the telephone when her eyes fell on a sight that made the hairs on the back of her neck bristle instinctively. Sitting in an enormous wing chair against one wall of the hallway was a haggard-looking woman. Her alabaster skin was slightly translucent, so that the wall was faintly discernible behind her. Her jet-black hair was a wild mess of madcap tangles, and she was dressed in the anachronistic clothing, the likes of which the real estate client had never seen before. People walked up and down the hallway, oblivious to the lure in the lone woman sitting there, staring blankly ahead with an expressionless look on her face. When the realtor got off the phone, the disturbed client promptly asked who the woman in the hallway was, only to receive the curt reply, "What woman?" Turning her gaze back to the hallway, the stunned client was unable to offer any response as she took stock of the now empty chair. Before she left the building, she asked a number of the employees if they had seen the lady sitting in the winged-back chair earlier. But not a single person had. One realtor, who had a clear line of sight from behind his desk to the hallway chair, swore that nobody had sat in the winged-back chair all day. The shaken client left the Ward house that day, determined never to return. Another individual who developed an aversion to the old building was the real estate company's custodian. The man would clean the office in the early evening after everyone had gone home. He had never felt comfortable in the house by himself and went through his duties as quickly as possible, spending no more time than necessary. But he altered his work habits after one evening when an invisible hand reached out of the darkness and grabbed his elbow as he climbed the first-floor stairs. When the man spun around to face whoever had grabbed him, he found himself staring into an empty space. Not 1 minute later, the janitor was out the door and in his car, shaking in fear. He stopped working evenings in the Ward house after that, choosing instead to come in during the morning when the office staff was starting their day. Shortly after the custodian changed his hours, employees of Carlson Realty were treated to another bizarre event. The realtors were posing for staff photos outside the building when one of the ward's invisible inhabitants made an unexpected appearance. She showed up in a Polaroid taken of the Carlson employee. In lieu of a well-dressed real estate agent was a woman with crazy black hair and pale skin, dressed in ragged 17th century clothing, looking blankly at the camera. This mysterious spirit grew bolder after the real estate office moved out of the Joshua Ward house. The people who worked for the small publishing company that occupied the brick building after Carlson Realty had flexible arrangements with their employer, coming into the office whenever they were able. The spirit must have felt more comfortable appearing before smaller audiences, because over the next few years, numerous people caught a glimpse of the same pale apparition while working alone in the office. One editor caught sight of the woman early one morning and saw the apparition slowly walk down the first-floor stairs before fading into nothingness. A local band, given permission to practice in the Ward house basement, probably had the most dramatic encounter with the pale lady. Permitted to play only when no one was in the building working, the band was in the middle of the song when the drummer looked up to see the woman with scraggly black hair silently staring at the musicians. By this time, the apparition had become something of a local legend. The drummer knew that he was staring at an object that was not of this world, and he was scared. "Everyone, get out now!" he yelled at his surprised bandmates, who couldn't see anything besides each other. After running out to the parking lot behind the building, the band listened to the drummer explain what he had just seen when a freakish moan drifted up from the basement speakers, a sound that suddenly made everyone in the parking lot freeze cold. The woman was wailing through one of the band's microphones, using the speakers to express some profound and ageless misery. The band never practiced in the ward house basement again. To this day, the identity of the pale apparition is a mystery. After all, it was George Corwin's remains that were buried in the foundation of the Joshua Ward house. So shouldn't it be his likeness that appears to frightened onlookers today? Perhaps the woman is one of the witches George Corwin passed judgment on, and her soul, unable to rest, haunts the closest thing on earth to the corrupt colonial magistrate, the foundations of his former home, and maybe not. Some have speculated that strange things have always been afoot in Salem, and that it was such inexplicable occurrences that led to the witch trials of 1692. More than any personal rivalries, adolescent mischief, or plain malevolence. These people might suggest there were witches in Salem 3 centuries ago, and the power of their magic was so very real. As they are with all other hauntings, any explanations are loaded with uncertainty. A gray area that the Salem witches continue to occupy in the American consciousness, celebrated here at the end of October, when the leaves turn orange, the days go dark, and the cold bite of winter comes riding in on the wind. Well, that was something else. So have you guys ever been to Salem, Massachusetts? And kind of what are some of the thoughts, ideas, questions that you have witnessed? I want to thank you guys all for listening, and you guys have a wonderfully spooky and blessed Halloween.